Tick-tock, time to rock. Good evening to all the Christians and the Jews and the Muslims and the atheists and the agnostics and the Hindus and the Buddhists and yes, even the Shintoists who are watching right now from all around the world. I'm David Wood, your friendly neighborhood philosopher, and with me is the mighty Robert Spencer. Robert, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself for everyone while I and everyone else here jumps on Twitter and Facebook and sends out a message to all your friends telling everyone that we're live.
Thank you, David. I am the director of Jihad Watch, which is an attempt to explore the motivating ideology behind jihad terror and to give news and commentary about that jihad terror activity. It is a news site at jihadwatch.org, updated many times daily. I'm also the author of 18 books, including many bestsellers, most notably, or I should say most recently, The History of Jihad from Muhammad to ISIS, the first and only comprehensive, all-inclusive, one-volume history of jihad in the English language that takes it right from the beginning, right up to now, and shows how jihad is a threat to the free world that the free world has always faced, faces now, and it has not changed. And yet what has changed is that our leaders seem to be completely ignorant and willfully clueless about it today in a way that they never were in history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I agree. I mean, even if you go to some of the early founding fathers or some earlier presidents, when they seem to know a lot about Islam and seem to have very accurate information that you just, we would be shocked. We would be shocked today to hear any politician who's this knowledgeable about Islam, and yet previous generations, they just seem to know what they're talking about, not just U.S. leaders, European leaders as well. And for everyone who's tuning in, I did put links in the description box to Robert's YouTube channel. Robert posts videos on YouTube, so if you're not subscribed to his channel, you can click on that link. A link to Robert's website, that's Jihad Watch, in case you're not following him there. And a link to Robert's latest book, which you just mentioned, The History of Jihad, and got the link there to his book on Amazon. Now, Robert, we are wanted to get you on to discuss some of the stuff that's been going on because many people started seeing a problem with Patreon, specifically because of Sargon. Now, Patreon has been banning people. This became a really big issue for a lot of people, specifically because Sargon has a big YouTube following, and so people were able to ask a lot of questions really quick, like what is he getting banned for? And when all the details were out, both from Patreon and from Sargon and from the other people on YouTube, many people were just confused as to why Patreon would ban him. And just so everyone knows the little background here, and we're gonna go on to other things. But the issue there was Sargon was interacting with some white supremacists who on another person's channel. So Sargon was a guest on someone's podcast, and there were some white supremacists in there, and he started calling them the kind of derogatory names that they call other people, right? So, yes, very, very horrible names that Sargon was calling them, but he was calling them these names because these are the terms that they find most offensive and they apply to others. So he starts calling them the same names. But these aren't terms that we would normally find it acceptable to call people, even if you're just using it against people who normally say the word. And so Patreon found this information about Sargon from over 10 months ago now and banned him. And the reason this was a problem was Patreon, their terms of service, their policies, say nothing about that. The only emphasis there on Patreon is that you can't post any kind of content like that on Patreon, right? They're not supposed to be policing other sites where you might share your information. So you just imagine here, right? Like YouTube can shut down your channel, but YouTube will shut down your channel for things that you post on YouTube, right? Your repeated copyright infringements, things like that. YouTube will shut you down for content on YouTube. Facebook will shut you down, but it's for content on Facebook. You don't have Facebook or YouTube or Twitter looking into the rest of your life and looking for reasons to shut you down. And so even people like me who would say, hey, Sargon, I understand what you're doing there, but you still shouldn't be using you still shouldn't be using the N-word, even if you're directing it towards white supremacists. But you have people like me who say, hey, yeah, that's in really bad taste, bad idea, but that's not something that Patreon should be banning you for. Patreon is a money channel, right? I mean, imagine that like Sargon's credit card company now calls him and says, we're canceling your credit card because you said this word against some white supremacists. Seems like a really, really, really weird situation. And this has caused quite an uproar. But long before Sargon was banned, several months ago, Robert Spencer here was banned from Patreon for what I would regard as a much, 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 much worse reason, right? They had a much weaker case against Robert, which was basically nothing. So we're going to get into that. We're going to look at some of the issues that are involved here. And but before we go into the specifics here, Robert, why are there people who are trying to get other people banned from platforms like YouTube and Twitter and Facebook, but also trying to stop people from being able to fund them? I mean, it's never crossed my mind, hey, I'm going to go out and try to get people to not be able to get donations or something like that. I would be like that if it was, people, collecting to chop someone's heads off, or if it was someone like, hey, I want to put out this book on how 8-year-olds can make crystal meth in their easy bake ovens. I would have a problem with that kind of stuff. But as far as people just sharing information, spreading ideas, having arguments, having debates, and it would never cross my mind in a million years to try and just shut them down from any sort of public discourse. So what's going on in the world?
Well, David, the David Horowitz Freedom Center, with which I'm affiliated, has Front Page Magazine, its online flagship publication. There's a quote there at the top of the page from David Horowitz saying, inside every liberal is a totalitarian screaming to get out. And I think they're getting out now. That increasingly, when I've spoken recently in the last few years at colleges and universities around the country, I hear people saying hate speech is not free speech. And I think that a whole generation of American college students is being indoctrinated with the idea that there is a concept called hate speech that is readily and objectively identifiable, that it's identifiable roughly with whatever dissents from the leftist agenda, and that the kind of speech does not warrant constitutional protection from the First Amendment guarantee of the freedom of speech, and consequently ought to be shut down by any means possible. And that the leftist social media giants, Twitter, Facebook, Google, YouTube, Patreon, GoFundMe, they are operating in an increasingly brazen way, according to the same principle, and shutting down people for so-called hate speech. I mean, I didn't know any of the background that you just gave about Sargon, and it's interesting because, as you know, in August when Patreon pulled the plug on me, they did it, they said, because MasterCard told them to. Mm-hmm. MasterCard never commented beyond talking briefly to a Breitbart reporter and telling the Breitbart reporter that they had told Patreon to do this because of illegal content on my site. Now, by that they must have meant Jihad Watch, because I didn't have anything, as you know, on the Patreon site except for the video that you and I made when you very graciously helped me to start the Patreon account. And we made the video where I was saying that I'd come into possession of an old television studio and wanted to fix it up, raise money to fix it up so that I could do regular videos from it. That was all that was on that site. There was nothing wrong with that. Mm-hmm. So clearly Patreon, as they did with Sargon, banned me for something else, which they've never specified, that was somewhere else, that was not on the Patreon site. MasterCard, saying this was illegal content, Well, the only place where I have any content really is Jihad Watch, aside from articles I write primarily for Front Page and PJ Media. And so the only way that anything could conceivably be thought of as illegal on Jihad Watch is if you were going by Sharia, Islamic law, which forbids criticism of Islam, and not by American law, which guarantees the freedom of speech. So I think that it was the only way to make any sense of it based on the available information is that Patreon and MasterCard pulled the plug on me for violating Sharia.
Yeah. Now, Robert, I've been to your house numerous times. We've done tag team debates before. We've debated each other before.
That's right.
So we've had plenty of interactions, both where we agree. We're areas where we agree are lots of issues related to Islam and jihad and so on. We have some disagreements as well. Notice when we have a disagreement, we say, "Hey, why don't we debate it?" Right? Why don't we debate it? That's our first instinct. Whereas there are other people who their first instinct is, "Oh, so and so disagrees with me. I need to try and shut him down so that no one ever hears any alternative to what I'm saying." But so I've been around you lots of times, and I've never seen anything remotely resembling illegal activity. Never heard you suggesting anything remotely resembling illegal activity.
Come on, remember I said, "Hey, David, come on, let's go knock over a bank."
Yeah, I know, but that was that was in private, right? I mean, other people didn't see that. So cat's out of the bag now, Robert. Now everyone knows why you're really getting banned. But let me before we go on, just because you just mentioned those two things, I did have, and I want people to be able to read it for themselves. So I'm going to go ahead and read a tweet you posted after you got banned from Patreon. And guys, just so you understand why this is important. Someone like Robert right now can't go teach at a university, right? Even though he's one of the world's top experts on the issues he deals with, he can't go teach at a university. He can't go be an instructor or something like that, or he can't do it because there would be endless complaints about him. I have a PhD in philosophy. Pretty much the only thing in the world you can do with a PhD in philosophy is teach philosophy, right? Because there's nothing else you can do it. There's a joke in the philosophy department. How do you get a philosopher off your front porch? You pay for the pizza, right? You get it? Because that's the only other thing you can do with a philosophy degree.
Right? You're a philosopher.
Yeah. So so the idea, and I realized back when I was a graduate student and the university was getting complaints about me. They never stopped me because they recognize, hey, he's just a student. We can't exactly stop him from, we can't stop him from going out and talking about Islam or doing debates or something like that. But they were getting complaints about me even when I was just a graduate student. And I realized back then, if I take the academic route and go become a professor somewhere, then I just have to shut up. I have to not say the things I want to say about Islam, about jihad. I can't talk about these things anymore. So in effect, I just decided, no, I can't live like that. I'm going to burn that bridge. I'm going to burn the academic route bridge where I would just go and teach philosophy because there were other things that I wanted to do. And I don't want people to be able to shut us down. But what that means is people can block you from certain career paths. They can block you from all kinds of public arenas. But it was my thinking back then, they can't block me from the internet. They can't block me from YouTube. As long as I'm following YouTube's policies, as long as I'm not violating their policies, people can never block me there. And therefore, I'm going to put all my energy into that. And so when that starts to change, and now, people can just block you for any and every reason just because they don't agree with what you say. Now we're getting into a much, much scarier ground. And so that's why we wanted to focus on this. But let me go ahead and pull these up. So back when you got banned, you tweeted, I've been axed from Patreon without explanation, warning, or notice, no doubt as part of the ongoing efforts of the left to deny all platforms to those who reject its agenda. To those who supported me there, thank you, and I'm sorry we couldn't follow through on plans. So you posted that, and then Patreon actually responded. Patreon responded, "Hi, Robert. We emailed you earlier today, which explained that, unfortunately, MasterCard required us to remove your account. You replied to us, but if you have further questions, we're happy to keep emailing. So they went ahead and explained why they did it, and their only explanation was MasterCard told us to. And so, but notice why that is frightening, right? Because there are lots of people who are supported by Patreon, right? I'm supported by people on Patreon. Patreon said in their terms of service, these are the only things you'll get blocked for. There's not one word there saying, oh, and if MasterCard calls us up and says, block this guy, you got to do it. Not one word there, right? So what Patreon is saying is, hey, we can just block you for any reason, and that should suffice as a complete explanation. Now, Robert, this has been going on for a while, right? It didn't start with Patreon doing this. So if you could sort of run through your experience with various platforms or funding sites.
Yeah, absolutely. In the first place, I should explain that I'm a hate group leader. Mm-hmm. Not really a hate group leader, but according to the Southern Poverty Law Center, I'm a hate group leader. The Southern Poverty Law Center is actually a hate group, which is dedicated to defaming and destroying people who dissent from its agenda, which is far to the left. It considers those who oppose jihad, mass murder of innocent civilians, and the Sharia oppression of women and others to be hateful. And so it listed me as a hate group leader. Now, for years, this has been the case. I never have taken it seriously because I see the Southern Poverty Law Center's obvious dishonesty and bias. But the problem is that the establishment media has always taken the Southern Poverty Law Center as if it were a reliable source. And so now, in addition, are the social media giants. This all started for me a couple of years ago when, after the march in Charlottesville, and I had nothing to do with the march in Charlottesville, was not involved, did not go, do not approve of the people who were organizing it, and somebody was killed there, and there was a great deal of consternation about right-wing extremists in the media at that time. And so a reporter for a very far-left Soros-funded publication, ProPublica, named Lauren Kirchner, she actually contacted me and said, you are, of course, a hate group leader, and how do you justify being on PayPal and Amazon and various other platforms? And I wrote back to her about the nature of fascism and how the Nazi brown shirts in the early 30s would go to universities and there would be anti-Nazi professors speaking. They would shout them down and physically menace them. Sometimes before the anti-Nazi professors would speak, the brown shirts would circulate defamatory material about them in order to try to discourage people from going. And I pointed out to her that she was actually following in the footsteps of those brown shirts and was far more fascist than I could ever be or would ever certainly desire to be, and that she should look to herself. She published an article in ProPublica where she got PayPal to ban, after which she got PayPal to ban me on the basis of her article, which was all about how this terrible hate group leader was being given all these platforms. There was an outcry, and PayPal backed down. But of course, these fascists have not stopped their efforts, and so Patreon fell into line in the summer of 2018, whereupon I went to GoFundMe, which also banned me after quite a bit of money had been raised. They refunded all the donations. Indiegogo did the same thing. And so it's very clear that these social media giants are marching to the tune of the Southern Poverty Law Center without any regard for the vicious bias or dishonesty of the Southern Poverty Law Center and its claims about the people that it's blacklisted. So it's funny that the same people that would talk about the McCarthy era as a low point in American history for the forcible silencing of these various communist screenwriters and so on are now the new McCarthyites and are vigorously pursuing the same kind of censorship against those they hate today.
Now, Robert, wasn't wasn't the Southern Poverty Law Center sued for, I guess it was defamation by Majid Nawaz, who's sort of a liberal-ish Muslim figure in the UK, and they put him on their hate group their hate group list, and weren't they sued, and didn't he win, and didn't they have to pay him millions of dollars because they had no grounds for actually calling him a hate group leader?
Yes, and I think that this is a precedent that has been unexplored by American lawyers. I'm still trying to interest lawyers in emulating it. And lawyers, I have to tell you, David, they are reluctant to do so for two primary reasons. One is that Majid Nawaz lives in Britain. Britain has libel laws that are very favorable to the plaintiff. America has libel laws that are very favorable to the defendant. And so to sue for libel is far easier in Britain than it is in the United States. The Southern Poverty Law Center was clearly afraid that Majid Nawaz would sue them in Britain and get an even bigger settlement. And so they gave him $3.5 million before the case came to trial, clearly worried that they would lose even more if they had to go up against him in Britain. And so American lawyers, when I have approached them about this, they've said, yeah, well, you're not in Britain. And so they are reluctant to take it on. Also, there is another fact, and that is that if you read the judgment, that the settlement rather, it was sent to me and I read it. I'm not sure it's public, but I was able to read the complaint that Majid Nawaz's lawyers actually sent to the Southern Poverty Law Center. And in their complaint, they said, look, this man is a reliable leftist and he believes in all the causes that you do. And so you should not be including him with all these right-wingers. Now, that's obviously not a line of defense that I can take or would want to take. And I don't believe in unrestricted immigration and the other things that Majid Nawaz's lawyers were praising him for and touting him for to the Southern Poverty Law Center. So that may mean that there's no way to go up against them. That's what lawyers have told me so far. But I'm still hoping to find lawyers who will realize that the idea that the Southern Poverty Law Center can, with impunity, defame and destroy those with whom it disagrees politically is a dangerous precedent to allow in the American public square, and one that is ultimately detrimental to the First Amendment. Mm-hmm. And so I'm still hoping to take legal action against the SPLC, but I think probably the main reason why it's hard to find lawyers who were willing to do so in the United States is because they have reportedly around $350 million, the Southern Poverty Law Center, and most people don't have anything like that kind of money, so they are people are not willing to go up against this massive machine, which they figure can blow them out of the water, bludgeon them with their millions, and win that way.
Now, Robert, didn't the Southern Poverty Law Center actually start off with some good goals and doing some good things?
Yeah, I don't know if I've said this before publicly, David, but I used to donate to the Southern Poverty Law Center. I'm very sorry to say.
Hey! I can point out the Southern Poverty Law Center has received donations from a hate group.
Yeah. It was way back in the 80s, and, I got some of their mailings about how they were fighting racism and so on, and I thought, well, that sounds great. Yep. Sign me up. So I sent them some money, and I was on their mailing list for years. I'm sure they've got me in their files somewhere. They probably have no idea it's the same Robert Spencer, but it is.
Well, that's just interesting because people even today, they hear, hey, this is the group that is out there fighting racism and so on. And as I understand it, way back in the day, they did things like suing the KKK and stuff and ultimately bankrupting actual hate groups. How is that different from what they do in the world today?
Well, the KKK, that's an actual hate group. I mean, what constitutes a hate group? It's not anything that has any kind of legal definition in the United States. But when you have a group that is directing hatred against another group, terrorizing them with violence, as the Klan has done, and doing so to innocent people solely because they are members of a particular group, a racial group, or a religious group, that's obviously that seems to me to be clearly a hate group. And when the Southern Poverty Law Center is going against such an organization, then that is reasonable as far as I'm concerned. Mm-hmm. But when they start to say that there are these anti-Muslim groups, so-called, in the first place, the premise is wrong. Why is it anti-Muslim to oppose violent jihad and Sharia oppression? We are constantly told that the vast majority of Muslims are peaceful people and tolerant people who reject every kind of terrorism. So if that's the case, then they ought to be standing with anybody who opposes violent jihad and Sharia oppression, and consequently it's not anti-Muslim to oppose these things. To say that it is to assume that every Muslim is in favor of violent jihad and Sharia oppression, which actually means that Southern Poverty Law Center is the anti-Muslim hate group, not Jihad Watch. Mm-hmm. Because they're the ones who are demonizing all Muslims. Yep. But I myself have never called for violence, advocated violence, approved of violence. I have never demonized anyone or said anything about anyone that I did not sincerely believe was true and was not able to substantiate. Everything in Jihad Watch comes from mainstream news stories, and in my books, everything is very carefully footnoted, annotated. The reality is that to say that you're criticizing some group or criticizing an ideology is tantamount to hate would ultimately mean you can't criticize any ideology at all. Mm-hmm. And the Southern Poverty Law Center, by its own criteria, could not criticize me because they would be directing hate against the hate groups, and then thus they would become hate groups themselves. Mm-hmm. Not because we are engaging in any actual hatred, but because they are characterizing as hatred any critical word, any negative word. If I say, geez, ISIS beheaded these people, isn't that terrible? Then that makes me a hate group. Well, what, you pro-beheading? Mm-hmm. It's ridiculous.
Oh, it's most certainly ridiculous. And I actually agree with it. I think you can make an outstanding case that the Southern Poverty Law Center, by its own standards, should be labeled a hate group. Because if you think what they do, right? Like, I have debated atheists in the past, right? I don't believe that atheism is true. So I believe in God. So I get up on stage with atheists and we have debates and I tell them they're wrong and that your view is false and things like that. No one ever says, oh, now you're a hate group because you're criticizing atheism and you're saying that atheists are wrong. But if you suddenly turn to Muslims and say, hey, Muhammad was not a prophet, you shouldn't be following him, he's the most obvious false prophet in history, then they will immediately say, oh, you hate all Muslims, you want them all to be killed, you want them rounded up and put on camps and sent to ovens, and you're clearly a hate group. And what I see there is they're the ones who are treating Muslims as completely different from every other group. And what they're doing is, hey, all of you other groups. So this was what I would regard as the position, not just of the Southern Poverty Law Center, but of everyone who thinks like them in the West, and there are plenty of them. But their real position is, hey, everyone else, you Christians, you atheists, all of you, you're all capable of defending yourselves against criticism, and you are responsible not to react with violence. You understand that. But there are these other people. There are these other people called Muslims, and you can't do that with them. You can't expect that of them. You can't criticize their ideology. They won't know what to do. They're not capable of interacting on a rational level, and so we just have to silence all critics. And so it's the radical leftists who are treating Muslims in a radically different. I mean, think when we say to Muslims, hey, jump up on stage and let's go ahead and debate these issues, we're treating them like human beings who are capable of interacting on a rational basis. But when we do that, groups like the Southern Poverty Law Center say, oh, you're a hate group for doing that, for treating these guys like you treat everyone else, for treating them like you treat rational human beings. You don't realize that they should be treated like barbarians, which is the way leftists treat Muslims. And so you guys are obviously racist for treating them like you treat everyone else.
It's an excellent point, David. And it reminds me that the Southern Poverty Law Center has an entire category of so-called anti-Muslim extremists. Anybody who opposes jihad terror in any public way is on the list. if they have any prominence in the public square. And so they don't really have anybody who is anti-Muslim but not extremist, or anti-jihad terror who is okay. If you oppose jihad terror, you're on their list. But the thing is, they don't have any category of anti-Christian or anti-Jewish. And Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, they have been scathing in their criticism of Christianity. I read Hitchens' book, God is Not Great. He's got chapters on the Old Testament and the New Testament as well as the Quran. He's withering in his disdain and dislike for Christianity. Why isn't that anti-Christian hate that would be a category on the Southern Poverty Law Center's hate list? I mean, I know Hitchens has passed away, but there are many others who are still spreading the same kind of rhetoric. And mind you, I'm not saying that Hitchens is hateful. I don't think he was. And I don't think that even Dawkins or Harris are hateful in their criticism of Christianity. They're talking about their dislike for this ideology and why they believe that it's implausible and why people should not believe it. That's a perfectly reasonable thing to do, and Christians have and should respond to their arguments and deal with them on a rational basis. But if the Southern Poverty Law Center were to treat criticism of Christianity the way they treat criticism of Islam, then Harris and Dawkins and other atheist writers would be, who's that ex-preacher that's got Freedom from Religion Foundation?
Dan Barker.
Yeah, that's the guy. I read his book too. He'd be an anti-Christian hate group leader. But of course, that kind of thing never occurs to the Southern Poverty Law Center because of this unconscious paternalism you've been describing. They think Muslims aren't capable of rational argument, and so they have to be protected from criticism in a way that Christians do not, because they assume that Christians are capable of rational argumentation or are tough enough just to stand up to criticism and be able to live and deal with it, whereas their poor, shrinking violet Muslim friends have to be sheltered and protected from any criticism because they simply can't handle it.
All right, now, Robert, we're going to go to some more of these tweets here because you've been called a white supremacist.
Yes.
Just to be clear, are you a white supremacist?
No, I am not now, David, and have never been a white supremacist. Thank you, Senator.
Do you believe that white people are superior to other races?
No, I do not believe that white people are superior to other races.
Now, there is a distinction between white supremacist and white nationalist. Do you believe that white people need to be preserved in their own independent nation and that other races need to be driven out of it?
No, I do not believe that white people should be preserved in their own independent. What a ludicrous idea. And other people should be.
You just called that ludicrous. You called the idea ludicrous, right?
Yeah, I'm an anti-white nationalist hate group leader.
We're about to get shut down from YouTube. Look, if Sargon can get banned from Patreon for calling white supremacists a name, then obviously we can get banned as well from making fun of white supremacists and white nationalists here. Just so your views here are on the table, do you believe that there are peaceful Muslims?
Yes, I do believe there are peaceful Muslims. This is like reciting the catechism or something, you know? Do you renounce Satan? Yeah. Yes, I renounce Satan. No, that's the baptism. Sorry. Anyway, go ahead. Yes.
So, if you're talking to a Muslim and he seems sincere and so on, and was claiming that Islam is actually peaceful, you wouldn't necessarily believe that he's just practicing taqiyya and he's really planning to chop your head off.
No, I think that if I've encountered, of course, many Muslims who say Islam is peaceful. I debated Mustafa Akyol, the Turkish writer, a few years back. I think Mustafa Akyol is dishonest. He can sue me if he wants, but I got plenty of reason to think so. I don't think he's an idiot. Actually, Mustafa, if you're watching this, it's a compliment to you that I think you're a liar, because I actually think you're smart enough and know enough about Islam to know that what you're saying is a lot of hooey. Mm-hmm. But in any case, if I meet, and I have met many Muslims who are not Mustafa Akyol, who are not debaters, who are not public figures who say Islam is peaceful, but they actually believe it, because they go to the mosque and pray and they don't hear any jihad, and people tell them Islam means you should be nice to other people and so on. I have no reason to believe that such people are insincere. It may be that they are not familiar with what the Quran actually says, which is far more common in Islam than many people realize. Because the Quran has to be recited in Arabic during prayers, and most Muslims do not speak Arabic and are not from native-speaking Arabic countries, they can actually memorize the whole Quran. And I once knew a guy, actually, real nice guy who was one of my neighbors years ago, and he told me, he was Pakistani, and he told me, and he was not joking, he said, I am very proud of my religion, and I've memorized almost the entire Quran, and one day I intend to get one of those translations and find out what it means. Mm-hmm. And I bet he was in for surprise.
That's actually far more common than people realize, memorizing the Quran and not knowing what it says. And what's amazing, Muslims actually treat this like this is evidence of supernatural revelation or something like that people can memorize it. It makes me think of I lived in my dad was in the Navy and was stationed in Greece when I was a kid, and there were Greek kids who didn't know any English, but they could recite entire songs that they'd heard on the radio, and so they could sing the entire song. And I would wonder now, well, does that mean that these songs were the word of God because they were so easy to memorize, even for people who don't speak the language? If I follow the arguments of Muslims, I might have to think so. And by the way, you're already being accused of being an anti-white hate group over in the comments section. I need to gather up these comments and send them to the Southern Poverty Law Center. Hold up, here you go. Robert Spencer, why do you support white genocide?
These people are just as idiotic as the Southern Poverty Law Center.
Well, I don't know. I don't know if he's joking or serious. He might just...
if he's I hope he's joking, yeah. But I know that it's out there.
If he's joking, that's actually funny, right? Because he's doing what everyone else does.
Yes.
Again on your views. Just so we're front and center with them in case people don't know what positions you hold. Do you believe that Muslims in, let's say, the United States of America need to be rounded up and put in camps or something like that, or executed to keep the rest of us safe from Islam?
No, I most certainly do not believe that. I would strenuously oppose such efforts, sir.
And yet you believe that jihad is a threat, so...
Yes.
How do you propose to deal with the threat if you're not just out? See, for some reason, this is what people hear. Oh, you believe that this ideology is a threat, therefore you must believe in rounding everyone up and slaughtering them or putting them in camps or doing something like that to not be killed by whatever you're saying is the big threatening situation. So what would your solution actually be? Just so we're upfront with it.
Enforce our own laws. It might seem simplistic, and I think when I say enforce our own laws, how many words is that? Enforce our own 4 words. People will not understand what I'm saying, so I will elaborate a little bit. Are you familiar, David? You used to live in New York City, and so did I. Do you remember the broken windows theory from the early 90s?
No.
The broken windows theory. Well, I lived in New York in the bad old days of the Koch and Dinkins administrations, and Mayor Ed Koch, who was actually not as bad as his successor, Mayor David Dinkins. The tenure of David Dinkins as mayor, 1989 to 93, is generally considered to be the low point for New York City, at least until recently. And Mayor Dinkins really let the city go. Crime was very high. It was dirty and squalid. Businesses were fleeing. Taxes were exorbitant, and so on. And when Rudolph Giuliani became mayor, he and the police chief that he appointed, whose name escapes me right now, I want to say Bratton, but I'm not sure if it was Bratton. Anyway, Giuliani certainly was mayor. He espoused the idea of the broken windows theory, which was that if the city, which had been ignoring graffiti and broken windows, would clean the graffiti off the buildings and enforce the graffiti laws, and repair the broken windows and present a clean facade, then the violent crime would actually go down. In the Dinkins administration and Koch before him, the cops would ignore graffiti and broken windows and petty vandalism and petty theft and so on and go after the big crimes. But Giuliani and his police chief argued if you go after the small crimes, then the whole atmosphere will improve and the large criminals will be intimidated and it will look as if the police are in control now in a way that they weren't before, and they will not operate. And in other words, in Dinkins' time, it was like the Wild West and there was no law. It looked as if nobody was in charge and it was just anarchy on the streets. And Giuliani changed that and gave the impression that the cops were in control. There was a city government, and so nobody could just get away with anything he wanted. And it worked. And New York it had experienced a new boom as crime rates went down and the businesses came back and so on. Okay. What does any of this have to do with jihad?
That's what I was wondering.
Lots of laws on the books right now, David, against things like polygamy, female genital mutilation, other things that are at variance with Islamic law. Every time there's a story, I remember a few years back here again in the Bronx, in New York City, there was a story of a building that burned down and some people who got trapped in it and got killed. A tragic story. And the New York Times ran a piece afterward profiling the people who lived there. And it turned out to be a Muslim with several of his wives. And the Times story, matter-of-factly, went to Ibrahim Hooper of the Council on American Islamic Relations, and he said, yes, there are thousands of Muslims in the United States who practice polygamy. Well, the New York Times didn't even bat an eye and just went on. But actually, polygamy is illegal in the United States. A lot of those polygamous Muslims in the United States, they only are practicing polygamy, of course, because they believe in Sharia. And Sharia also enjoins jihad. I'm not saying every polygamist is a jihadi or that every jihadi is a polygamist, but that there is, if you are a polygamist, an indication that you believe in Sharia and are implementing it in the U.S. So if we enforced laws against polygamy, that would clear up a lot of the problem. If we enforce laws against FGM, that would clear up a lot of the problem. And a lot of jihadis would be caught up in the net. You see? And I think that it's an analogy to the broken windows theory. If we simply enforce laws that are on the books, which we're not doing. There was just recently a couple of doctors in Detroit who were arrested. First trials ever for female genital mutilation, which has been going on. Thousands of girls in the U.S. have been subjected to it. First trial ever, and the judge throws out the case. He says it's illegal because of religious freedom to ban female genital mutilation in the United States, which is an astonishing ruling. Is the religious freedom really a license to break our other laws? And is it a mandate that we have to give up our own culture and allow women to be abused in this way? And these things have to be settled. But if they were settled favorably for women and for human rights in general, then we would be able to deal with this problem in a quite effective manner.
So your position is actually that instead of letting lots of things slide, which would be parallel to the situation with groups like the Southern Poverty Law Center, who want to keep Muslims in a different category where they are not treated like the rest of people. You're saying that actually judges and lawyers and police are doing something similar by letting Muslims slide on a bunch of these things, saying, well, you're not really capable of following the same laws that the rest of us follow, so we're going to let you slide on those things. So you're saying that one of the steps that could be taken is just treat everyone as equally under the law. Yeah.
And that would, because you have Sharia denying the freedom of speech, denying the freedom of conscience, denying the equality of rights of women. I mean, that's another thing. We know that in the UK there's a rampant abuse of the Sharia courts such that spousal abuse is not prosecuted. The UK should not be standing for that, but they're spineless, witless dhimmis, and so they are. But if we prosecute spousal abuse even among Muslims, even if it's politically incorrect, here again, these things that are at variance with Islamic law that are at variance with American law, that Sharia supremacists will practice, they will disclose to us a lot of people who might be inclined to wage jihad in the United States. The jihad terror attacks would go down, and women's rights would improve, and various other things would improve only if we enforced our own laws and held everybody accountable to the same laws.
And just so my cards are on the table, because let me go ahead and put it up here so I can use this as an opportunity to give my view on this. Callum S. says, what can the UK do to tackle Islam? Because they are in a rougher position than we are in the United States. Yes.
Same thing. Close the Sharia courts, enforce British law in the Sharia enclaves, the so-called no-go zones, and make everyone accountable to the same laws. The British authorities are failing their people by allowing for Sharia to be essentially the law of these areas in Britain that mostly Muslims live in, and allowing for FGM, allowing for the Sharia courts with the wife beating and so on. All these things, if they were stopped and everyone were accountable to the same law, they would find the same beneficial effect would result.
Now, Robert, my solution for both the United States and the UK is similar in that it's also perfectly peaceful. Now, to be clear, I understand solutions can't always be peaceful. If there's a terrorist attack happening or something like this, yes, the police need to stop that, often by shooting a person, something like that. If there's a military threat, yes, the military has to deal with that. But when we're talking about dealing with jihad, we're fundamentally talking about an ideology that gives rise to these kinds of attacks. And so at some point you have to deal with the ideology. My view on dealing with the ideology is just stop protecting it, right? I don't believe that Islam can really stand up to criticism. I don't believe that Muhammad as a prophet can actually stand up to criticism. There's a reason Muhammad ordered his followers to execute and to murder both male and female critics, people who made fun of him. There's a reason, namely, once you're allowed to openly criticize Muhammad, there is so much that you can throw in people's faces that makes him absolutely unbelievable. And that's why for 14 centuries in Muslim areas of the world, you can't criticize Muhammad. They'll kill you. But we go to the West and we find more and more people trying to silence and shut down criticism of Islam, not only courts, but as we see platforms, various social media platforms, and various MasterCard, right? MasterCard, Patreon, for shutting people down for doing nothing other than criticizing jihad and jihad ideology. And they're shutting people down. So you have a similar situation over here, and it's really horrible in multiple ways, because if you think about it, you've got basically all of Hollywood praising Islam endlessly. You've got politicians praising Islam. You've got the media endlessly praising Islam. Educators at almost every college campus in the United States will praise Islam endlessly, tell everyone how wonderful Islam is. So at the end of the day, the only time you hear criticisms of Islam are from people like me and Robert, or from people like those of you in the comments section who also, criticize Islam. But guess what? If politicians and the media and educators and entertainers are all telling you Islam is wonderful, and a couple of people like us are saying, actually, no, it's not. We can show you from their sources why it's not. We look like there's something wrong with us, right? We look like we've got a problem because everyone else is sharing a different message about Islam. So it looks like there's something wrong with us. But as far as dealing with the ideology, if Hollywood doesn't have to come out and do what we do. I don't think they need to do that. They should shut up because they don't know what they're talking about. Same thing with politicians and educators and journalists. If they don't have to come out and expose Islam, but they should quit talking about it if they don't know what they're talking about, and stop defending it if they have no clue what they're talking about. And so I believe that the people who don't know about Islam just need to get out of the way and let people who do know about Islam expose it. And I believe that ultimately will undermine the ideology. I do not believe that Islam can stand up to criticism, right? In other words, just to give you an example, right? Almost every Muslim you'll ever run into believes that the Quran has been perfectly preserved right down to the letter from the time it was revealed to Muhammad. Absolute nonsense, not according to us, according to the manuscript tradition, according to Muslim sources. Entire chapters were lost, large passages were lost, verses were lost, verses were eaten by Aisha's sheep, right? All kinds of nonsense like that. And you would never conclude from reading the sources that this book has somehow been perfectly preserved. Allah couldn't protect the Quran from a sheep, right? So if people just get out of the way and
David, because those verses were bad.
Yeah, yeah, I had to. So if people just stop defending it mindlessly and get out of the way and allow the information to come out, well, that undermines people's case for Islam. And so, again, yes, you do have to deal with physical threats. You do have to deal with military threats. You do have to deal with actual terrorists, responding to them in a physical manner, right? But the ideology, you can crush the ideology just by getting out of the way of people who can expose it, like people like Robert.
Well, I couldn't agree more. Absolutely. But what we have is just the opposite. They're not getting out of the way. They're getting in our way increasingly under the guise of protecting the world from our so-called hate. But as we have noted, it's only in one direction. Only this one ideology, this one belief system is to be immune from all criticism. And others, it's have at it.
And let's go through some examples here. I'm going to pull up some more of these tweets. And this one is actually from someone famous. So for the past couple of days, since the bans by Patreon have become an issue again, the issue of Robert being banned by Patreon, even though it was several months ago, came up again. And so the question was, hey, why is Robert banned? And we have this from Soledad O'Brien. Now, who's that, Robert?
She was, I don't know if she's still on CNN, but she was a CNN talking head. Mm-hmm. And she's still a leading leftist journalist, and with the Hearst publications, I believe, but I'm not quite sure what she's doing right now.
And so she says here, she's responding to your tweet saying, I've been axed from Patreon, and she says, possibly because you're a white supremacist. Now, that is, you basically have two categories of people who call you a white supremacist. One category is people who are confusing you with someone else. So what's going on there?
Yeah, there's this clown Richard Spencer who is a white supremacist, and he, for years now, he has been constantly confused with me. It's very annoying, really. I go to Amazon and I see reviews of my books where they say this white supremacist neo-Nazi is now writing about Islam. Or I see that I am named in news articles that are dealing with his activities, and so it's a very unfortunate confusion, and has caused me a lot of trouble over the years. But well, ultimately, I find it mystifying. I don't know why people have so much trouble keeping this straight. Mm-hmm. It's Richard Spencer and Robert Spencer. Nobody ever says, what about that atheist writer Robert Dawkins, mm-hmm. or the former president Robert M. Nixon? You never hear about these guys. So I don't know why they can't keep it straight when it comes to us. And I think some of it is, on some people's part, is malicious.
Now, I would understand some stupid person who doesn't, follow the news very carefully and has heard someone with an R. Spencer name confusing you with someone else, confusing you with Richard Spencer. But someone who's a crack journalist, supposedly, and has been following the news for years and who knows exactly who Richard Spencer is, it's kind of weird that she would be so confused by this, that she can't tell the difference between two names, and that she would be so quick. That she would be so quick to toss this out there, to just say, hey, you're a white supremacist. Now, by the way, obviously she came back and apologized once you corrected her, right?
Oh, obviously not. No, she deleted the tweet when she was inundated with people telling her that I wasn't and that she had the wrong guy. But no apology, of course. But I think it's especially ridiculous on Twitter because, well, you know something? Richard Spencer himself said, Richard Spencer and I had some unpleasant interactions a few years ago on Twitter where he said, you're obviously a Jew. You're obviously secretly a Jew. And I said, I do not have the honor of being a Jew. And he'd say, oh, come on, you've changed your name. What's your real name? It's not, clearly not Spencer. And, what have you changed your name from, Jew? Anyway, this was Richard Spencer. He really is a Nazi. And, he looks like one, he looks like, he has patterned his hairstyle in particular after the brown shirts of the early 30s. And he has light brown hair and Teutonic features and so on. He plays the part well. But you look at me, and as he said of me, I look like an anti-Semitic parody cartoon. And this is what he said. But certainly many people have thought, yes, Robert Spencer must be Jewish. So I think, how is it that Soledad O'Brien saw my tweet about Patreon and saw my picture there this swarthy fellow with the black beard and thinks, oh, that's the neo-Nazi. Mm-hmm. It shows a carelessness on her part of rather catastrophic proportions.
Yeah, that is. And then not to apologize afterwards. I mean, you'd think it's a pretty serious accusation calling someone a white supremacist, right? That if you get that one wrong, well, one, you should be careful about applying it. But the fact is, they're just not anymore. That's the first thing they hurl at someone they disagree with. White supremacist. What? You don't agree with me on every issue? You're a white supremacist. They've just been trained to do that. But then to be corrected on it, not to apologize. Yeah. I mean, these are our reporters nowadays. But she's one category of someone who would call you a white supremacist. But just to be clear, we have you on record as saying you are not, in fact, Richard Spencer.
She's not ever gone record saying anything. All she did was delete her tweet.
No, I'm saying we have you on record acknowledging that you are not, in fact, Richard Spencer.
I am not now and have never been Richard Spencer.
Senator. Okay. But you're a hate group leader, so we don't know if we can trust anything you're saying.
Actually, in this connection, I should say, David, I just remembered that the Southern Poverty Law Center also actually says that I'm a white supremacist on the basis of an article I wrote, about 7 or 8 years ago, criticizing multiculturalism. Mm-hmm. And apparently the Southern Poverty Law Center thinks that to say that Western culture has value is somehow white supremacist. Mm-hmm. It's a wildly misleading headline on their article. Robert Spencer shows his white supremacist colors or something like that, but it's only based on this article. And all I did in the article was say cultural relativism and multiculturalism are bad ideas, and Western culture is something that ought to be preserved. This is, as far as the Southern Poverty Law Center goes, white supremacism.
Well, what race would Western culture be? Because it seems we're a mix of races.
Well, they don't think so, apparently. They think apparently
so
that
they think that the West is only for white people?
Yeah.
Wow.
They're white
These guys are a hate group on multiple levels. This is shocking. Just to be clear, everyone, in the United States, the goal, the overarching theory of interaction has been the melting pot, right? In Europe in recent years, it's been multiculturalism, meaning you come from, let's say, Pakistan. Don't adopt English culture if you come to England. Don't do it. You stay separate. So notice that's been a disaster, and people across the board are acknowledging that this has been disastrous. Not that other people from other lands are coming, but that they are not becoming part of one culture. Whereas in the United States, the goal has been, yes, we've got people who've come from all around the world, very different cultures, and it all blends together into one American culture. Like taking a bunch of different ingredients and making a big delicious pot of chili with it, right? You get this new delicious thing. And so why would you say, hey, this amazing thing that we have here, you can come and be part of it, but you're going to be part of this pot of chili. You're not this other pot on the side that doesn't become part of the pot of chili, right? So anyway, I don't know if that's a good analogy or whatever, but yeah. So, but yes, historically, the goal in America, which is why it works in America better than the European system, is the goal over there has been multiculturalism, keep your culture separate, and it's almost like the attitude is you're doing something bad if you adopt Western culture, right? If you're Pakistani and you come and you adopt an English culture, you've done something bad. You've somehow polluted yourself or something like that. Whereas, yeah, in the United States, you come and just be part of the United States. So anyway, very, very strange stuff. All right, let's go. So that is one category of person who would call you a white supremacist. And we've only got a couple minutes left, so we'll just get some brief comments on these. Joe G says, I've read your stuff. And yes, you are. So notice, this is not someone who's confusing you with Richard Spencer. This is someone who's read. He has read the history of jihad and all your different books. He says, I've read your stuff, and yes, you are. I'm glad MasterCard made the recommendation to terminate your ability to process payments, and I'm glad Patreon followed it. You, sir, are a white supremacist and a proto-fascist. So it's good you're getting called out on your censored.
Yeah, I asked this guy. I responded to him, asked him to give some examples, some quotes from me illustrating white supremacism and proto-fascism. And he, of course, had nothing, as it always happens.
It's too many. It's too many to give, Robert. There's too many examples. I can't give any.
They can't even give one. Many times I have asked people on Twitter when they say you're a racist, you're a white supremacist, you're a whatever. Can you quote me? Can you give me one? Nope. Mm-hmm. They never can.
Yeah, and I've seen you do that probably 80 or 100 times when people are calling you white supremacist and you say, give me a quotation. Now, here again, it would seem I would not call someone a white supremacist unless I'm joking, right? Like unless I'm joking and I'm applying it ironically or something like that. I wouldn't call someone a white supremacist unless I had some very good reasons to think they're placing their race very high on the totem pole or something like that. But here it's just, I mean, it really seems, hey, I don't agree with what you say about jihad, so I'm going to call you a white supremacist because that's the nastiest thing I can think of in my head.
Yes. That's about the level of discourse that they're operating on. These people are not stringent, disciplined thinkers by any means. And of course, they've been told, they have been indoctrinated for years by groups like the Council on American Islamic Relations and the Islamic Society of North America and others that any opposition to jihad terror is racism. Mm-hmm. And so they're used to thinking of me in that category, in that framework. And of course, the Southern Poverty Law Center just aids and abets that.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, that's really, I mean, it's so incredibly dumb, right? The only reason you could be opposed to, I mean, let's just look at the recent example in Morocco. The only reason you could be opposed to jihadis going out and slaughtering and beheading tourists simply to make an example to the West. The only reason you could be opposed to that is if you're racist against Moroccans. Now that sounds insane to me. It sounds like you would have to be a complete lunatic to think like that, and yet that seems to be the dominant view among lots of people in the media and educators and so on.
Yeah, as if they had beheaded a couple of Moroccan girls, then you and I wouldn't have had anything to say about it.
Yep. We would have just been fine with it there, according to these people. So anyway. That's the situation we're in. Let's look at one last example here of another person who's calling you a white supremacist. This is the annoyed Norwegian. Boy, those Norwegians. Robert Spencer was, along with Pamela Geller, one of the main scholarly inspirations for Anders Behring Breivik in Norway. They are very dangerous people. Now, Robert, I went through Breivik's manifesto. I mean, some of it's just rambling recipes and his daily activities and stuff like that. But the parts where he actually discusses how he came to his views, I went through all of those in that 1,500-page manifesto. And according to Breivik, he came to his views about Islam first by, this is what he said, and don't know how true it is or not, but he said he kept seeing Muslims beat up the natives, the native Norwegians, the entire time he was growing up. And he saw this over and over and over again. So this gave him a negative view of Muslims. Then he says he went to the Quran and the Hadith, read them, and came to his views about jihad. And then after seeing how various politicians react to things, he, depending on some exact dates, sometime between 1999 and 2001, he decided to start planning his terrorist attack. Now, Robert, I had never heard of you by that time. So had you influenced him, let me put it this way. Is it even possible for you to have influenced him in any way, any time before he started planning his terrorist attack?
No. I published First About Islam in 2002. And so there's no way that Anders Breivik could possibly have been influenced by me to do what he did. Also, it has to be borne in mind. There are many people, I get this all the time, and there are many people who say, you radicalized Breivik, you inspired Breivik, you're responsible for Breivik, you have blood on your hands, and so on. And these are very, very serious charges, and they require a serious answer. And I think that it has to be borne in mind what I said earlier. There has never been any context in which I have ever called for violence or advocated violence. So he was violent. What does that have to do with me? And people will say, oh, but see, you were spreading hate against his targets. Well, actually, I wasn't spreading hate against anybody. I was criticizing an ideology. Yes, and he killed people because you criticized this ideology. So the upshot of their saying that I'm responsible for Breivik is to say that no one should be able to criticize any ideology because some nut somewhere might decide to become violent as a result. Mm-hmm. That, of course, is a completely incoherent position that would make it impossible to have any discussions about anything at all unless you just agreed with it. And so I cannot accept the idea that I have any responsibility for this, because there simply is no logical basis for thinking so.
And I have to point out, not only does Breivik condemn you for not taking a violent approach.
That's right.
He does explain why he turned to violence. So after he's come to all of his conclusions about what Islam teaches and so on, you might wonder, okay, so you concluded that Islam is dangerous. Why did you decide to go on a killing spree? Why did you decide that? He gave two explanations. He said, one, he learned from Islamic terrorist attacks that the only way to make your voice heard is by deadly, bloody shock attacks. So he actually says, I learned this from Muslims. This is who I learned this from, right? This bloody response. Two, he said he concluded because people shut down any open, honest discussion of Islam, that it's pointless, that it's a waste of time. He said, if I were to bring up my grievances about Islam and about jihad, I would just be shouted down as a racist. Therefore, it's a waste of time. And I have to resort to my own means. Right? So think about this. What's he saying? He's saying, hey, all you politicians and journalists who shut down open, honest discussions about Islam, you Southern Poverty Law Center that labels anyone a hate group who disagrees with jihad, you're the reason I'm going on a killing spree. You're the reason, because you guys make it impossible to have an actual open, honest discussion. That's why I'm going and killing people, taking matters into my own hands. So it's just amazing to me that the one person who has absolutely nothing to do with anything Breivik did, you, are the one who is behind his deadly attack and consistently gets blamed for it.
Yeah, it's obviously it's a very convenient thing for them, and it's as if he were hired by who knows who. And I'm not saying he was, but it couldn't have worked better for the global forces that want to silence any criticism of Islam and jihad. He's been a very valuable weapon for them.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking about the irony. Breivik says, and I'm pointing this out because this is a conclusion I believe other people will come to eventually, right? Other people will come to this conclusion that we cannot have an open, honest discussion about Islam. It's going to be pointless. People are just going to call us racist. Therefore, I just have to take matters into my own hands. Other people are going to, now to be clear, you and I don't believe it's over. We believe we still can have this discussion, and I happen to believe that Islam is going to keep pressing with jihad until people actually start to listen to what we have to say. But the irony here that other people could come to this same conclusion, and Breivik says, hey, the reason I'm going on a killing spree is because you people won't let me solve my difficulties, my problems, or share my objections with my speech. You guys have shut down open discourse on these issues, therefore I'm turning to kill. And then that attack is now used to silence more people, right? So, yes. and for years it was, not just with you. Anytime you brought up any criticism of Islam, they said, aha, this is what gave rise to Anders Breivik. This is the attitude that gives rise to Anders Breivik. And so we have to silence these people so we don't end up with more Anders Breivik. Silencing people is what led to Anders Breivik.
The European Union has made very great use of him. They've had whole conferences about him and ostensibly dedicated to preventing any more attacks of this kind. And in doing so, they have worked assiduously to silence any criticism of Islam. They cut out whenever possible, the names of attackers. And that is in service of Islam also, even when the attackers are not Muslim. The only reason why they have stopped reporting the names of attackers is because so many of them are Muslim. And you have very suspicious attacks, like just today in Austria, there was a man who started randomly stabbing people in the neck on the train. And you got to wonder, the Quran, of course, says when you meet the unbelievers, strike the necks. He started striking the necks. They immediately said he was mentally ill. No name released. Well, you got to wonder.
Now, that's just amazing because as far as consistency is concerned, the accusation against you is, well, Breivik did quote you as a resource on what Islam teaches about jihad. He quoted you, therefore you are his inspiration, and you drove the attack, even though you completely disagree with him and would regard him as a nutcase. But if a jihadi, quoting the Quran, quoting the Hadith, quoting Muhammad, launches an attack, it has absolutely nothing to do with Islam, and you're a racist for saying that it does.
That's right. And even just yesterday in all this Twitter storm over Patreon and Soledad O'Brien and so on, I got this guy saying, you radicalized Breivik, you're a criminal, you ought to be in jail, you have blood on your hands, and so on. And somebody said to him, what about the Quran? And he said, well, see, that's just it. That Spencer's always saying that the Quran incites violence, and so that is incriminating himself. And he ought to go turn himself in for inciting Breivik. And I pointed out in response that the Quran, in many, many cases, many, many verses, kill them wherever you find them, which is, of course, at 2:191 and 489, and also at 9:5, kill the idolaters wherever you find them. When you meet the unbelievers, strike the necks, 47:4. Many, many verses enjoin violence against unbelievers, whereas there's nothing in my 18 books or thousands of blog posts or hundreds of articles that ever calls for any violence. Mm-hmm. So how can you say that one incites and the other doesn't? It's ludicrous. Or that my work on the Quran shows that somehow I have responsibility for Breivik. The cases are not the same because I do not call for violence. Mm-hmm.
And so it's just a wild situation. I mean, when you have to be that inconsistent as a journalist or as a politician defending these claims, right, that you're responsible for Breivik, but actual commands of Allah and Muhammad are not responsible for jihad, even though it's Allah and Muhammad who are specifically calling for violence against unbelievers, and you don't call for violence at all. The level of inconsistency there, the level of hypocrisy should rule a person out, rule out a journalist, rule out a politician as a rational person. I mean, consistency is sort of the fundamental basis of rational thought. And the fact that they have to be utter hypocrites, utterly inconsistent is just amazing. All right, well, we're going to wrap up. I do apologize Robert. There were tons of people over here with questions and comments, and we didn't get to them. And a lot of them were good questions, but we wanted to sort of get through this. Wanted to sort of get through the entire issue. Wanted to thank everyone who jumped in on the super chat. Dan M, Edward, Amato Francisco, 1 and 3, Gregor Patterson, Anijo Oiden, Rivi,
David.
Willie Darren. What's up?
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just was looking myself and I see somebody saying, S. Larock saying, Dear Mr. Spencer, a while back, James White accused you and Ms. Geller of editing a chat with Yasser Qadi. Could you please provide your take on this? James White didn't actually do that. He agreed. He assented. He nodded his head sympathetically as Yasser Qadi accused us of tampering with his video in which he says that the Jews and Christians are like animals and you can seize their property and wage jihad against them and so on. Actually, this is one of the reasons why James White is not a trustworthy authority on these issues, because he is so terribly credulous. Yasser Qadi made that accusation and James White did not question him or make any effort to discover the truth. And even worse, I wrote to James White and said neither Pamela Geller nor I had anything to do with that video. Not only did we not edit it, we didn't even put it up. Mm-hmm. It's on the Americans for Peace and Tolerance video channel, and we are not involved with the Americans for Peace and Tolerance. And what's more, the full video is available and you can see that it wasn't tampered with. It's an excerpt, but it's not chopped up or misrepresented in any way. And White did not correct the record. Didn't
Qadi say something like you guys brought in lawyers and
yes,
stuff
that
like
was
that?
all fantasy. None of that happened. He claimed that he tried to get it taken off YouTube, and we 6 lawyers on him and kept it up. We couldn't have done that if we'd wanted to, because it wasn't our video. And when none of this happened, Yasser Qadi is a very smooth liar, a deceiver, war is deceit, and all that. And James White is his credulous apostle.
So we have. So we're going to go ahead and wrap things up. Thank you for everyone in the super chat. Sorry we didn't get to a bunch of questions, but we should have a live. We should have a live stream sometime where we just answer questions, right? Where we could just take questions. I am going to be back at 8 o'clock, so 45 minutes from now. I am going to be back with Sam Shamoon, where we are going to be. We're just going to be taking Q&A. We've got a comment from YouTube that we're going to address at the beginning because it deals with a lot of objections to Christianity. We're going to do that, and then we're going to just take questions. So if you had a question that isn't specifically for Robert and is for other things, then meet us back at 8 o'clock. Now, Robert, since you're being deplatformed in other ways, what can people do to support you? Well,
Jihad Watch is still able to receive donations through PayPal and also Anadot. You can find the links on jihadwatch.org. And I appreciate that. I had hoped actually through Patreon to raise some money personally, not through the Jihad Watch organization, in order to fix up the studio, but that's on hold for now. If I find some way to do that, then you will certainly be the first to know.
All right, and I'm actually hoping that Patreon learns its lesson, and much like you advocate for the United States and other Western nations, actually starts enforcing its own policies, which was not to block people or ban people for things that are done on or said on other platforms. So those of you who can, the link to Robert's website is in the description box. Also, be sure to subscribe to his channel and check out his book, The History of Jihad, if you don't have it. Awesome book. And we'll see you all. I'll see you in 45 minutes if you're still here, and we'll see Robert next time. God bless everyone.